Hi, my name is Christopher, and I'm a member of Team 2A.
So for today's lesson, I'm going to give a very basic introduction to programming. So I'm going to begin by what programming is. So programming is the process of designing and building an executable computer program that accomplishes some sort of task. Or more simply put, it's giving instructions to a computer in order to produce some sort of results, which is in this case a playable game. So there are many different programming languages like Python, Java, C, but today again we'll be focusing on a very basic and intuitive form of block programming known as Scratch. So in Scratch we are able to create games that involve sprites or movable characters that we can code using these blocks of code provided. So I'm going to begin by discussing the layout of Scratch. So Scratch has a number of subsections and folders which show the corresponding function of the blocks of code provided. So for example, these motion blocks all pertain to the motion and the movement of the sprites, like their vertical, horizontal, rotational movement, which is based on a built-in X and Y coordinate plane. So this section here, the screen, is essentially a coordinate plane with different X and Y positions. And you can control the direction of the movement of these sprites by changing the angle that it points to, or you can change the starting position of the sprite by setting it to specific X or Y coordinates. The looks blocks control the physical appearance of the sprite, such as its color, the costume, size, whether it should show on the screen or hide. You can also change the backdrop of the game. The sound blocks, it's basically in the name, they control the sound effects that may be placed in your game, like when the sound should play, how long the sound should play, the volume of the sound. The event blocks control how or when an action should occur. So for example, you can trigger a series of code by clicking on the green flag, which is this block here. When you press a certain key, when a message is received from, some other previously executed series of code. The control blocks are really important, especially when you're creating a game, because when you use these blocks, a series of code can be repeated that's placed inside the block, for forever, a certain amount of time. And you are also able to create a condition that must be true before the code inside is executed, like this if, these if blocks. Or you can delay the execution of code until a certain action is performed. The sensing code is generally placed inside a larger block from the control section, like the if statement. You can trigger an event to occur if the sprite touches the color green or another sprite, and this is essentially the sensing or sensing blocks. The operator blocks are simply mathematical operations and symbols, like basic addition, subtraction, greater than, less than, which is commonly used within an if statement. And you can combine these operations with the AND block, for example. And there's also a random number generator which can come in handy. The variable code allows you to create a variable, name the variable, assign a value to the variable, and you can use this later on in your code. So this is the section where you write the code. This is the section where your code will run and the sprites will move around. And then there's some additional information in the bottom right corner where you can create sprites, change the backdrop, you can look at the X and Y coordinates, the size, direction, the name of the sprite, if the sprite is hidden or if it's shown. So I'm going to start by some very basic sprite movement. The first thing is this when the flag is clicked event handler. So an event handler basically has a certain amount of code associated with it that is run whenever a certain condition is met or whenever a certain action is done. So, for example, with this, whenever this flag is clicked, the code underneath it will be run. So, for example, if I add a move 10 steps block, when I click the flag, you can see that the sprite moves 10 steps. So this is your event handler, and this is your motion block. You can also have turning, so you can move 10 steps and then turn 15 degrees. You can have, when it's clicked, go through random position. It's going to go where, any random X and Y coordinate it can go to. And another thing to note is that code runs in sequence. So it's going to move 10 steps, then turn, and then if you add another block, it's going to move another 10 steps after it turns. That can come in handy whenever you're designing or creating a game. So now I'm going to quickly go into these control blocks, and more specifically these loops and these if and else statements, because they're pretty important when it comes to programming. With these if statements, you need some sort of condition. So again, these sensing blocks usually used in conjunction with one of these control blocks. So let's say, I'm touching a mouse pointer, or I press the space bar. It's going to run this code that's contained within this if statement. For example, when the space is pressed, it's going to move. And the issue with this code is it runs this very quickly, and if this condition is not met, it's not going to move. So this needs to be looped until this if condition is met. So that's why it didn't move in this scenario, because I wasn't pressing the space when this code ran. So if I press and hold the space bar when I press the flag, it's going to move because this condition is met. But let's say I wasn't pressing the space bar. What is the sprite supposed to do? Well, obviously it didn't do anything, but let's say I wanted the sprite to do something else if I wasn't pressing the space bar. So that's where this else comes in handy. So if I'm pressing the space bar, I want the sprite to move 10 steps. But if I'm not pressing the space bar, I want it to go to some random position. So in this scenario, I'm not going to press the space bar, and it's going to go to some random position. But if I am pressing the space bar, it's going to move 10 steps. But going back to the initial issue that I went into with this condition, is this code runs quite quickly. So it's impossible to time the press of my space bar with when this code runs. So that's why we use a loop. So let me add back in this if statement. So now this code is going to run, basically until I stop the program using this stop button. And it's going to wait for me to press the space. When I press the space, it's going to move. And so this is pretty useful in this scenario. So now I'm going to stop it. Just for fun, what do you guys expect would happen when I run this? Yeah, so basically it's going to go to a random position until I press the space bar, and it's going to run, forever until I press the stop. So that's basically loops in a nutshell. But let's say you didn't want this forever loop. Well, you can also have repeats until a certain condition is met. So it's just like an if statement, but this code runs until something happens or something is met. You can repeat a certain number of times, and that can also come in handy. So that's basically Scratch in a nutshell. It's pretty much everything you'll need to know about Scratch to complete the activity. So I'm going to give a brief demonstration of a game, a very simple game that uses some of these blocks that I went into in order to do something quite simple. So with this, we have our event handler block, our when the flag is clicked. It's going to show this sprite. So this sprite is this cat. Obviously the code is still running, but it's going to reveal the cat because previously it was hidden, and it's going to go to the starting position. And then it's going to repeat forever, that forever loop that you were introduced to earlier. And there's also a condition block, this if else. And so this is going to repeat basically until the stop is pressed, and when the sprite is not touching the apple, then it's going to move 10 steps, which is what you saw. And when it's touching the apple, well, it's going to increment the score by 1, and then it's going to hide the sprite. So with this code, when the flag is clicked, sprite is revealed, points 90 degrees, and it moves until it touches the apple, and in which case the score is incremented by 1. But you aren't constrained to just one event handler. You can have another one that also runs, and this is this other code here, which initializes this variable score, or sets score to 0, and shows the score in the upper left-hand corner, so you can keep track of how often the sprite touches the apple. So that was just a little demonstration of some of the code in a more functional fashion. So this week you are going to be coding your own block-based game. You're going to have to create an account and follow these instructions. The instructions should be fairly intuitive, and you're going to create an eating game. So essentially, there's going to be a cat sprite whose movements are controlled by the arrow key, and it's going to try to eat an apple sprite, which will move around the screen to various positions. So go ahead and follow these instructions, and then answer these questions at the end. And I hope you guys have fun.